Growth often feels like loss because the mind measures progress by what is being added, while the deeper self recognizes progress by what is no longer needed. Most people expect expansion to feel energizing, affirming, and upward. They expect to feel more certain, more inspired, more connected to who they are becoming. But many forms of real growth begin by weakening the structures that once made you feel coherent, and that weakening can feel far more like grief than freedom. You may notice this first in the strange heaviness that appears when something old no longer fits, even if you cannot yet name what has changed. A role that once felt natural begins to feel exhausting. A goal that used to organize your effort begins to feel distant. A version of yourself that once gave shape to the day still exists in memory, but it no longer carries the same life inside it. That is often where grief begins, not when something disappears completely, but when it is still present and no longer alive in the same way. Most people misunderstand this moment because they assume grief only belongs to obvious endings. They think grief arrives after a breakup, a death, a move, or a visible collapse. But grief also appears when an inner arrangement is ending. When a self-image is loosening, when a way of being that once kept life stable is no longer supported by your deeper alignment. The outside of life may still look intact, which is exactly why the person going through it can feel confused by the weight they are carrying. What makes this harder is that growth often removes a form of familiarity before it offers a form of freedom. The mind is built to trust what it has repeated, even when what it has repeated is limiting. So when a familiar pattern starts dissolving, the nervous system does not immediately celebrate. It reacts as if something important is being taken away. Because in a real sense something is. A known way of orienting to life is ending, and the body experiences that ending before the mind can explain it. This is why growth can register as grief even when the change is right for you. The body does not ask first whether a pattern was true, it asks whether a pattern was familiar. If the answer is yes, then its loss can feel destabilizing. You may know on some deeper level that a role, belief, rhythm, or identity no longer belongs to you, and still feel sorrow as it fades. That sorrow does not mean the change is wrong. It means that a real bond existed between you and the old form, even if that bond was temporary. You can see this clearly when someone outgrows a version of success they spent years building toward. They may reach the thing they once wanted, or come close enough to realize they no longer want it. And instead of feeling relief, they feel emptiness. Not because success is bad, but because the self that organized around that pursuit is beginning to dissolve. There is often grief in that moment, because even a misaligned dream can become a home if you lived in it long enough. Leaving it may be healthy, but it still feels like leaving. The same pattern appears in relationships, callings, and spiritual identities. A person may outgrow the need to be the one who always fixes, always explains, always holds things together, always appears strong. On the surface, this looks like positive movement, but the deeper reality is that these identities often provided belonging, structure, and predictability. When growth begins removing them, it does not simply create space. It also exposes how much of life was being stabilized through those old arrangements. This is where many people turn against themselves. They assume that if growth is real, it should feel clean. They assume that if something is aligned, it should arrive without grief, without confusion, without inner resistance. But that expectation comes from a shallow understanding of transformation. Real transformation is not only about stepping into something new. It is also about living through the emotional consequences of releasing what once kept you organized, even when that old structure had already reached its limit. You may notice something important when you begin watching this pattern more closely. The grief is not always about wanting the old thing back. Often the grief is about no longer being able to be who you were inside that old thing. That is a very different kind of sadness. It is not always attachment to the role itself. Sometimes it is the recognition that a chapter of selfhood is ending, and with it a way of experiencing meaning, effort, and identity that cannot be recovered in the same form. This is why growth can feel lonely before it feels liberating. The people around you may only see that you are changing, but they may not understand what the change is costing you internally. From the outside, it may seem like you are becoming clearer, stronger, or more honest. Inside, you may feel as though the old emotional coordinates are disappearing faster than the new ones are arriving. That in-between space is difficult because it asks you to live without forcing false certainty, and most people were never taught how to do that. There is also a quieter mechanism at work. Growth changes what your awareness can tolerate. Once you begin seeing certain truths about yourself, your life, or your patterns, you cannot fully return to the old arrangement without feeling friction. That friction is part of the grief. You are not only losing what was familiar, you are losing the ability to pretend it still fits. In that sense, growth creates grief not only by removing something, but by making self-betrayal more visible. That is why some forms of sadness are actually signs of increasing honesty. A person may think they are becoming less motivated, when what is really happening is that they can no longer generate energy through false alignment. They may think they are falling apart, when what is really happening is that an older structure is no longer able to organize their life in the same way. They may think they need to fix the heaviness, when the heaviness is asking them to feel the loss of a former self without rushing to replace it. The sadness is not always an interruption of growth. Sometimes it is the emotional texture of growth itself. The spiral view makes this easier to understand because it does not reduce development to simple ascent. It recognizes that growth is often circular, recursive, and layered. You return to familiar emotions, but from a different depth. You revisit grief, but now it is connected to a larger change in identity, orientation, or purpose. What looks like regression from the surface may actually be a deeper round of integration, because the same experience is now being understood through a wider field of awareness. This changes how you meet the heaviness. Instead of asking only how to get rid of it, you begin asking what is ending beneath it. Instead of assuming the sadness means something is wrong, you begin considering that it may be registering a true transition. Instead of demanding immediate relief, you may start listening for the old structure that no longer holds life the same way. That shift in perspective does not erase pain, but it prevents pain from being misread so quickly. There is also a practical implication here that matters. If growth can feel like loss, then not all discomfort should be treated as a problem to solve. Some discomfort is a signal of misalignment, but some discomfort is the body and psyche processing a real release. If you treat all grief as failure, you will interrupt changes that need time to complete. You will try to rebuild identities, routines, and motivations that are already passing away, simply because you mistook grief for error. This does not mean every heavy feeling is sacred or that all sadness should be left uninterpreted. It means discernment matters. There is a difference between suffering that asks for care and grief that asks for room. There is a difference between collapse that needs support and transition that needs patience. The deeper work is learning how to tell when the heaviness is warning you that something is wrong, and when it is quietly telling you that something old is being released. Once you begin to understand this, many moments in life start looking different. The season when your ambition thinned out may not have been failure in the way you thought. The time when certain relationships felt strangely distant may not have been emotional deadness. The period when your spiritual language stopped feeling true may not have meant you lost the path. It may have meant you were outgrowing a set of structures that had completed their work, and your sadness was the evidence that the release was real. This is where a gentler strength begins to form. Not the strength of pushing through every feeling, and not the strength of naming every pain as purpose, but the strength of staying honest while something changes shape inside you. You begin to see that growth does not always announce itself as inspiration. Sometimes it arrives as disenchantment, fatigue, grief, and quiet disorientation. Sometimes the first sign of freedom is not lightness, but the painful recognition that you can no longer live from what once defined you. And that recognition changes more than people usually understand at first glance. What deepens this even further is the fact that grief during growth is not only emotional, it is structural. When an old way of being begins to dissolve, it changes how your energy moves, how your attention organizes, and what your inner life can still participate in without friction. That is why you may feel tired in places where you once felt driven, or strangely quiet in situations that once activated you. The system is not simply feeling sad. It is reorganizing around what it can no longer honestly support. Most people assume motivation disappears because they are failing to maintain it. They think they need more discipline, more inspiration, or a stronger reason to keep going. But often what is happening is that the self who used to generate momentum is losing centrality. It had a method for producing effort, and that method may have relied on proving, pleasing, escaping, or becoming. When those engines weaken, you do not just lose speed. You lose the emotional architecture that once made speed feel natural. That is why growth can feel disorienting, even when nothing dramatic has happened on the outside. You may still have the same responsibilities, the same skills, the same visible life, and still feel as though something foundational is shifting underneath it all. This is not only because your preferences are changing, it is because the meaning structure behind your behavior is changing. The same actions no longer serve the same inner purpose, and you feel the difference long before you can explain it clearly. You can see this in the simple experience of trying to return to a former version of yourself after you have already changed. On paper, it should work. You know the role, you know the rhythm, you know how to produce the old result. But when you step back into it, the fit feels wrong in a way that is difficult to justify. That wrongness is often where growth reveals itself, not through the excitement of the new, but through the increasing impossibility of fully returning to what once felt normal. This is why grief and confusion so often travel together. Grief says something is ending. Confusion says the new pattern is not yet visible enough to trust. When those two meet, people tend to panic because they cannot anchor themselves in either direction. The old form is loosening, and the new form is still emerging. That space in between can feel like emptiness, but it is often a period of recalibration rather than absence. The spiral view helps here because it does not measure progress only by what is clearly formed. It pays attention to what is becoming impossible to sustain. That matters because many important thresholds do not arrive as clear new identities. They arrive as the slow loss of your ability to keep living from a previous arrangement without cost. The loss of ease is not always failure. Sometimes it is the first visible sign that the deeper self has already moved before the outer life has caught up. You may also notice that grief during growth has a revealing quality. It shows you what you were using for orientation. If losing a certain role leaves you feeling invisible, then that role was likely carrying your sense of worth. If losing a certain ambition leaves you feeling empty, then that ambition may have been holding more than your goals. If a spiritual framework stops working and you feel suddenly unprotected, then it may have been functioning as shelter long before it was functioning as truth. Grief exposes not only what is ending, but what you built yourself around. This is where a person begins to understand why growth can feel more intimate than achievement. Achievement often adds something visible. Growth often removes a hidden dependency. One may change what other people can see about your life. The other changes what you can no longer lean on internally. That is why some of the most important growth periods look unimpressive from the outside, while carrying enormous consequence within. There is also a reason grief can become sharper when you begin to understand what is happening. At first, the pain feels vague. Later, it becomes more specific. You start to see the exact identity, expectation, or inner contract that is loosening. That clarity can help, but it can also intensify the emotional reality because now the loss has contour. What was once a heaviness becomes recognizable as the ending of a long relationship between you and a way of being that once made life navigable. And this is why patience matters more than force in these seasons. If you try to solve growth grief too quickly, you usually reach for replacement instead of understanding. You create a new role to cover the loss of the old one. You create a new mission to avoid the uncertainty. You create a new certainty to escape the tenderness of not knowing who you are without what is ending. But quick replacements often preserve the same structure in fresh language, and the deeper transformation stays unfinished beneath the surface. A more honest process asks a harder question. Not simply, what am I moving toward, but what is no longer carrying life in the same way? That question changes the pace of the whole experience. It stops treating heaviness as an interruption and starts treating it as information. It gives the sadness somewhere to point. And once sadness has meaning, it can be listened to without needing to be worshipped or denied. You may notice something else when you begin holding grief this way. It becomes less theatrical and more precise. Instead of becoming a story about how lost you are, it becomes a feeling with direction. It tells you where the old structure still lives in your habits, your language, your expectations, and your body. It shows you where you are still trying to animate a form that has already started to empty. That is when grief stops being only pain and starts becoming a form of perception. This changes the experience of waiting. Most people think waiting is passive, but there is a kind of waiting that is deeply active. It involves not rushing to define yourself too quickly. It involves noticing what continues to fade and what continues to return. It involves letting the system reveal its new priorities through repeated truth rather than immediate declaration. In that sense, waiting is not a lack of movement. It is the refusal to force a premature shape onto something still unfolding. There is an important implication here for anyone who tends to measure themselves harshly. If growth can feel like loss, then some seasons of low certainty are not evidence of weakness. They may be evidence that your inner life is refusing a false coherence. That refusal can look inefficient, it can look unproductive, it can look emotionally inconvenient. But if it is rooted in deeper honesty, then what appears to be a breakdown in performance may actually be the beginning of a cleaner alignment. This is also why the phrase "trust the process" can feel too vague to help. Trust does not come from pretending the grief is easy. It comes from recognizing the pattern clearly enough that you no longer mistake every loss of energy for failure. It comes from seeing that some forms of sadness arrive because the old life is no longer being fed in the same way. It comes from understanding that freedom often begins as disloyalty to an identity, a dream, or a structure that once served you well. When seen that way, grief is not the opposite of growth. It is often the emotional evidence that growth is actually happening. And yet even that understanding is not the end of the matter. Because once you see that grief can belong to growth, another question naturally begins to arise. If some forms of loss are not interruptions but thresholds, then the work is no longer only about surviving the heaviness. It becomes about learning how to distinguish between what must be mourned, what must be released, and what is quietly trying to reorganize your life from a deeper center than the one you used before. The real shift begins when you stop asking only whether the pain is valid and start asking what the pain is organizing you around. Grief is not just something you feel, it is something that changes what you reach for, what you avoid, what you remember, and what you expect from the next moment. If you do not look at that carefully, you may think you are processing a loss when you are actually rebuilding your life around it. That is why the deeper question is not simply what hurts, but what kind of future this hurt is quietly training you to live inside. Some forms of grief soften you into honesty. Other forms of grief harden you into identity. The first kind lets you feel the ending without needing to make the ending your name. The second kind turns pain into a center of gravity and begins asking the rest of your life to orbit it. This is one reason growth can become confusing. Two people may both be grieving a real threshold, but one is being opened by it while the other is slowly being organized by it. You can usually tell the difference by watching what the grief makes more possible. If it increases sincerity, patience, depth, and your tolerance for truth, then something healthy is moving through you, even if it feels heavy. If it increases performance, self-dramatization, isolation, resentment, or the need to be constantly recognized for what you have been through, then the grief may have stopped being a process and started becoming a structure. That does not make it false. It means it has moved from being a lived passage to being a place of residence. This matters because growth grief is meant to be integrated, not enshrined. It is meant to reveal where life is reorganizing, not become the new identity that explains everything. When people do not know what to do with loss, they often give it permanent authority. They let it narrate the world, define relationships, filter possibility, and determine what can be trusted. But if grief becomes your lens rather than your teacher, then even real growth will begin to look like threat. That is why the ability to mourn without constructing a new prison is one of the quieter strengths a person can develop. It requires you to let the ending be real without making the ending your entire self-understanding. It asks you to feel the weight of what is leaving without assuming that life can now only be interpreted through absence. This is not emotional suppression. It is discernment about what deserves to shape your identity and what only deserves to be honored as part of your passage through change. You may notice something important when you begin practicing that kind of discernment. The same sadness feels different when it is being held by awareness instead of running the whole system. It may still ache. It may still return in waves, but it no longer carries the same power to define what everything means. That is often where growth becomes more visible. Not because the grief is gone, but because the grief is no longer occupying the place where identity used to stand. This is where many people first begin to understand the difference between processing a loss and becoming loyal to it. Loyalty to loss can look noble because it often feels serious, deep, and emotionally honest. But it can also become a way of staying connected to what has already ended. A person may keep rehearsing the pain because the pain still feels like relationship. They may keep telling the story because the story still feels like contact. In that sense, grief sometimes persists not only because something mattered, but because repeating the wound feels like the last available form of connection. That is a hard truth, but it explains a great deal. Sometimes what a person cannot release is not the event itself, but the identity they formed in response to the event. The wound gave shape. It gave explanation. It gave a reason for certain patterns, protections, and limitations. If that identity begins to loosen, the person may experience that loosening as another loss, because now they are not only grieving what happened, they are grieving the possible end of the self they became in order to survive it. This is one reason growth can feel like grief even after the original pain has long passed. The system is not only revisiting the event, it is reconsidering the architecture built around the event. It is asking whether the strategies, postures, and inner promises that once made life feel survivable are still necessary now. That question is profound because it does not only ask what happened to you, it asks what kind of self was built in response and whether that self is still meant to lead. From the spiral view, this is where grief becomes inseparable from identity. The ending is not only external, it reaches into the way awareness has been arranged around memory, safety, and meaning. If a person learned to become useful, invisible, strong, detached, hyper-aware, or endlessly capable in order to survive a former season, then growth may require loosening those arrangements. That loosening does not feel abstract. It feels like losing the internal shape that has organized life for years. No wonder grief appears there. Something central is being asked to move. You may also notice that when a deeper reorganization is underway, the usual forms of self-encouragement lose some of their force. Positive language does not always help. Harsh discipline does not always help. Even insight can stop feeling immediately useful. That happens because the issue is not only cognitive, it is structural and lived. The system is not waiting for a better slogan. It is waiting for a more honest relationship to what is ending and what is emerging in its place. This is why gentleness and seriousness have to work together here. Gentleness alone can become avoidance. Seriousness alone can become self-punishment. But when they are held together, something more accurate appears. You begin taking your experience seriously without assuming that every intense feeling deserves total authority. You begin being gentle with the grief without handing over your future to it. That balance is subtle, and it matures slowly. But it changes the entire quality of the passage. A person walking this well starts to live differently in small ways before they live differently in obvious ways. They may stop reaching for old explanations the moment discomfort arises. They may notice when sadness is true and when sadness is being used to reinforce a role. They may begin declining the temptation to turn every heaviness into prophecy. None of that is flashy, but it is deeply important. It means the person is learning how to stay with change without over-identifying with its emotional weather. And once that begins happening, the grief itself starts revealing more than pain. It starts showing sequence. You see what first began to loosen, what resisted, what returned, what asked for care, what asked for release. The experience becomes more intelligible without becoming simplistic. You realize that not every wave meant the same thing. Some waves were about mourning a role, some were about disorientation, some were about fatigue, some were about the fear of living without a familiar pattern. What once felt like one heavy blur becomes a field of distinguishable movements. That distinction matters because it restores agency without forcing control. Agency here does not mean making the process happen faster. It means meeting different inner movements differently. Mourning can be honored, fear can be steadied, exhaustion can be cared for, false identity can be named. If all of these are treated as the same undifferentiated heaviness, then growth remains murky longer than it needs to. But if they begin to be recognized in their own nature, the whole process becomes more livable. This is where the earlier question returns with more depth. What must be mourned, what must be released, and what is quietly reorganizing your life from a deeper center than the one you used before? Mourning belongs to what mattered and is truly ending. Release belongs to what no longer has the right to organize your future. Reorganization belongs to the slow forming of a life that is not built from the same hidden contracts as before. These are not interchangeable, and much of maturity is learning not to confuse them. If you mourn what should be released, you may keep sacred what is only outdated. If you try to release what should be mourned, you may become emotionally clean on the surface while carrying unresolved sorrow underneath. If you mistake reorganization for collapse, you may interrupt a necessary transformation simply because it did not arrive in a form you recognized. This is why understanding matters so much. It does not remove the gravity of the experience, but it changes how you stand inside it, and perhaps that is one of the quietest truths in all of this. Growth does not only ask whether you are willing to change, it asks whether you are willing to become more accurate about what kind of change is actually happening. Sometimes you are grieving an ending. Sometimes you are releasing a structure. Sometimes you are being reorganized by a deeper alignment that has not yet become visible enough to trust on sight. Learning to tell the difference may be one of the ways a person stops merely surviving transformation and starts walking with it, which opens into questions that only become clearer once the next layer begins to show itself.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.